This is the Spirit and Wellness Show. News and information from a higher perspective. With your host, Harry Wilkinson.
Yes, I am your host, Harry Wilkinson, and welcome to the Spirit and Wellness Show. This is the show where we take a look at the days and weeks events, happenings in the world of politics, international news, the media, entertainment, as well as our own health and well-being. And we take a look at these things from a higher perspective, from a spiritual perspective, if you will. And often in this course of this show and in the years I've been doing it, we'll take one or two examples of news stories that are, dominating the headlines, and we take a step back from it. And in taking that step back, we recognize something. We see through the illusions. We move away from the triggers or the button pushing that either gets us into a perspective of seeing something as negative, or gets us excited, or thinking of something as very desirable. And we take a look at what we're creating and what it means to us, and how we can go into that and use it to expand our awareness, to reconnect. And so that's a lot of what we do here. We also talk about, different areas of spirituality, different developments in those areas, in science, breakthroughs in science. Very big science proponent on this show, but in a way that is, well, let's just say that it is not mutually exclusive to have a spiritual perspective and a scientific perspective. In fact, they often merge, much to the chagrin of both scientists and traditional religious people. But the main theme of today's show is, the title is Spiritual Evolution, and I'll get to what I'm talking about. That it has to do with a new research poll that the Pew Research organization has put out about the state of religion. And I will, we'll take a look at what that means. This is not a religious show, as I say over and over again every week. This is not a religious show. I don't talk about religious dogma. I'm not coming from a particular set of beliefs other than, maybe sort of broader term metaphysical or mystical beliefs, but no traditional religious, organized religion perspective. I talk about religion. There's an interesting article on the Pope today, which we might get to. So I do talk about religions, but this is not a religious themed show. But one of the big themes that often I come back to over and over again, and we're going to come back to it today, is that spirituality and religion are not the same thing. They still continue to be used interchangeably by so many people. But there is a dawning recognition, though it's often spurious at best. But there is a dawning recognition of this, that spirituality and religion are not the same thing. In fact, more often than not, I would venture to say, I used to say just sometimes they can be, but now I feel like more often than not, religion not only isn't spiritual, it actually impedes or gets in the way of one's own personal spirituality. And this is not a new concept, I know, but still somehow it has yet to seep through, but perhaps it is beginning to, that spirituality is something that is part of us, part of the human experience, and beyond the human experience. Whereas religion is an organized effort to establish a set of rules for that, perhaps for that spiritual nature that we are aware of. But often not even to do that. Often it's just rules to establish certain kinds of behaviors and to make people behave a certain way. So we're going to get deep into this on this particular segment of this show. Plus, we're also going to talk about ways to make your barbecue healthier, because here it is, May 17th. Memorial Day is a mere 2 weeks away, and so we're getting ready for the summer, and that means barbecues, and there are a lot of ways to make that barbecuing a lot healthier. There are health concerns with barbecuing, particularly if you are using things like coal. There are some carcinogens and things that people are concerned about. So we're going to talk about that today. And but first, let's take a look at the news headlines before we dive into the heart of the show here. We're going to take a look at some of these news headlines in the world. Now, of course, and we've talked about the earthquake in Nepal, and I mentioned in the last show that I believe this was going to be one of those events that brings people into connectedness, a recognition of how much we affect each other, and through the prayers that are going on, and through the reaching out that's going on throughout the world, you can you see how these events can bring out to the world ways to understand our own connectedness, because we are able to feel for others that are not in our daily wheelhouse, if you will. So there's a nice article here about an actress. Her name is Michelle Yeoh, and she's returned to Nepal. She was actually caught in the first earthquake there, which happened in April. And she's part of a relief effort in Kathmandu, and she is calling for the international community to help the Nepali people. She described what happened during the earthquake and spoke of the biggest thing, which was fear. She said that it was important to come back. And they've continued to have earthquakes, over the past couple of weeks. So it's a situation that is not over by any stretch of the imagination. And the extraordinary devastation that's going on is quite it's quite startling. And the ability for us to respond to these situations gets more and more, it improves each time, but it also gets more and more difficult as these natural disasters intensify. And I don't know if you've noticed, I've noticed that the intensity of these things, whether they be earthquakes like this or storms, which a lot of people chalk up to global warming, but it just seems to me like the intensity of these natural events has stepped up considerably. This earthquake in Nepal was more devastating than any previous ones in that region. When we had the tsunami a couple of years ago, that was unprecedented. So we keep moving into new extreme territory with these events. It's just interesting, and it is obviously we're creating these events to be more and more startling and more powerful, and perhaps we need them to be more and more powerful to bring us together in more and more powerful ways. Very interesting. So also in the headlines, the Cannes Film Festival is going on, and Cannes is very it's a very sparkly, trendy, gossipy kind of experience, but they also have some very important films in Cannes, and so we're looking at some new films that are coming up that may be of interest, and I will be going through those films, and we'll be looking for ones that may or may not be spiritual films. Those of you who are familiar with my documentary on spirituality in film, you know what I mean by that. A spiritual film, in my perspective, may or may not have anything to say directly about spiritual life, but reflects an idea or a concept or an awareness that people find perhaps spiritually uplifting. Good examples of these are, one of the best examples I always use to try to help people who don't quite get this idea is the movie Groundhog Day with Bill Murray. I mean, it really has this sense of a metaphysical sense to it, where if you're not familiar with the movie, the main character is a rather obnoxious weatherman that's stuck in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania for Groundhog Day, finds himself trapped, reliving the same day over and over again. And each time he does something a little different. Each time he relives the day, he grows a little bit. So it's one of those films that people find really, I think, a sense of enlightenment from. So, as I said, we'll be looking for films of that kind of nature that kind of touch us at the highest level of our awareness. And sadly, one of the greatest blues musicians of all time, Mr. B.B. King, passed away. And that's touched many people's lives, as did his music. He was a bridge, in a way, for bringing the style of blues to the awareness of people that might not otherwise have had exposure to it. He played, blues, which was specifically African American, and in fact, in his beginnings of his career, which goes back to the 1930s and 40s, in those days, as a black performer, he couldn't play anywhere other than black venues, and resistance to even having blues music played on on stations, white stations, was very strong. But as rock and roll grew in the 1950s and into the 60s and knocked down those doors, it left an opening for Mr. King to come through and bring that awareness of blues back to American audiences and to white American audiences. Interestingly enough, as blues was being embraced by 60s rock gods like Eric Clapton and the Rolling Stones, at the same time, really in the same moment during the 60s, the African American community, not the entire African American community, but many young black people were turning away from blues and have turned away from blues. And it's just an interesting phenomenon. There are, I suppose, reasons for that. It seems that, at that time, the young African Americans wanted to sort of rally around perhaps an identity or representation of themselves that was not linked to the past, to sadness, to the rural, sharecropper kind of existence that had gone by. They wanted something more sophisticated, more urban, if you will. And so, things like Motown became what a lot of African Americans rallied around as their music, and blues became something that they walked away from. At the same time as a lot of white people and white rock artists were embracing it and giving it new life and working it into their performances. So B.B. King was very instrumental in all of that, in maintaining perhaps the connection with the African American community while also breaking it out to a wider audience. So, sad passing of Mr. King, but certainly his music is still with us, and would encourage anyone to go and seek it out. It's his performances are charming and upbeat and just a lot of fun. All right, so now let's move into this Pew report that has been getting a lot of attention in the news. So, and this isn't the first report to say this, by the way. I just wanted to make that clear. There was a report out, I guess, last year saying basically the same thing. But this is a look at millennials in comparison with the other sort of generational groups that have been given these names. We have, for the purposes of this study, the generations that were looked at were called Silent Generation, which was apparently 1928 to 1945 was the Silent Generation. I'm not sure why they're called the Silent Generation, but I think they were the generation that, if you remember, the beat movement of the 1950s and so forth, I think they were the generation that were the driving force behind that. And then you have the baby boomers, 1946 to 1964. Generation X, which they say is 1965 to 1980. Older millennials, 1981 to 1989, and younger millennials, which is 1990 to 1996. So I don't know what anybody born after 1996 is going to be called, but anyway, it's kind of silly, these little compartmentalized boxes we have for people, where I guess if you were born December 31st, 1964, you're a baby boomer and you share baby boomer sensibilities. But if you were born January 1st, 1965, the day after, you're no longer a baby boomer. Now you belong to the Generation X club, and you share those characteristics. I think there's a lot of crossover here, but anyway, moving along, just to talk about this, what they're seeing is that the millennial generation are declining in their involvement in religion. A greater number of this youngest generation consider themselves to be unaffiliated. 36% call themselves unaffiliated, or in the words of this report, they call them nuns. Those that are saying that they are either atheists or agnostics, or that their religion is nothing in particular. So we have an increasing number of millennials rejecting religious labels. 36%, which is very interesting. 36% of the millennials consider themselves unaffiliated. The next largest segment is 19% that consider themselves evangelical Protestants, which is radically different from the unaffiliated. It's like going from one end of the spectrum to another. But that's fascinating. And then it just goes down from there. 11% are mainline Protestants, traditional Protestants. 6%, 6%. Black Protestant, and so forth and so on. So, people are making a lot of this, and the religious leaders are wondering, how do we get millennials back into the church? It says, while some millennials are leaving their childhood religion to become unaffiliated, most millennials who were raised without a religious affiliation are remaining nuns in adulthood. 2/3 of millennials who were raised unaffiliated are still unaffiliated, 67%. So this apparently has been continuing to go on. There was an earlier poll similar to this, in 2014, saying much the same thing, that attitudes are changing. So I have a few things to say about this, as you might have guessed. First of all, when we look at the millennial generation, and this is the generation that, as a teacher, they're the generation I have taught. So I feel a great deal of connection with them, both the older and the younger millennials. And what I think needs to be understood is a couple of things here. This is a group of young people who don't like labels of any kind. So not only are religious affiliations decreasing among this generation, the poll also found that political party affiliation is decreasing radically. The vast majority of millennials consider themselves to be independents, rather than either Democratic or Republican. They do tend to be quite liberal, but in being liberal, they're also not defining themselves within the traditional Democratic Party, which has been supposedly the bastion of liberalism. So that has to be understood, that labels of any kind, anything that is restrictive, is not something millennials are going to adhere to or get into. And there's a lot of talk about how, the relationships that a lot of millennials build are done through social networking, using the internet. And that is a generational shift for a lot of people that some have not been able to really make. And, millennials understand social networking in a way that if you, grew up in a time when there wasn't that sort of thing around, you might have trouble understanding. So there's that aspect of it. But what I really wanted to get to here was, what is inconclusive in this study. And what, again, they don't talk about. They've talked about religion, and they have all of these religious groups, and then the unaffiliated. And they lump everything into this unaffiliated category. So that means atheists, agnostics, and people who have a sense of spirituality, who understand spirituality, but aren't connected to a religious group. They're all lumped together into this one category called nuns. So that really makes this study not very indicative of what's going on. You need to look at that section of the millennials that are calling themselves, that they've been lumped under this title of unaffiliated, and find out what their sense, if any, of how many of them consider themselves to be spiritual but not religious. How many of them consider themselves to be atheists or materialists. Those are the things that need to be looked at if you want to have a full understanding and discussion of this topic. But again, it comes back to this thing where somehow, the mainstream press and the mainstream ideas still haven't quite gotten to the point where they will differentiate between religion and spirituality. But it must be done, because the spiritual but not religious movement has been growing exponentially in the same way, and that the survey is showing Americans considering themselves unaffiliated to religion. So we're up to 37% of the millennials doing this now. What I want to do is talk about that aspect of it. And I'm going to talk about an author by the name of Sam Harris. Sam Harris wrote a book about 10 years ago called The End of Faith, in which he predicted, that the new atheist movement would take over, and that religion was dying, and so was any kind of spiritual belief. This book actually dismissed any and all experiences of spirituality as, worthless, stupid, dunderheaded belief. Well, he has changed his tune on that one. He has a new book called Waking Up. And in this book, he talks about experiences of personal spirituality. As I think many in that 37% of the millennials that have unaffiliated labels are also aware of. In the book he writes, I will use spiritual, mystical, contemplative, and transcendent without apology. However, I will be precise in describing the experiences and methods which merit those terms. He says, spirituality begins with a reverence for the ordinary that can lead us into insights and experiences that are anything but ordinary. self-transcending experiences is what he calls them. So much of it has to do with semantics and words that people are comfortable with and not comfortable with, words that have been emotionally charged. So the G word causes problems. There was sort of a negative blowback to the idea of spiritual but not religious for a while. But it seems to be changing, and the reason I think it's changing is because we, as human beings, are evolving spiritually. And I think the young people, the millennials, are reflecting that change. It's not just happening to them, by the way, but it's happening, to a greater degree with them, because they're younger and they have different experiences. But spiritual but not religious means a lot of things, but it means to be able to be both spiritual and scientific. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, the idea that those two concepts are mutually exclusive is absolutely ridiculous, but it has been promulgated for years. The fact of the matter is, you don't have a full experience of either of those things without science. Science has shown us that we have a gene, the VMAT2 gene, that is directly related to spiritual experiences, to these self-transcendent experiences that Harris is mentioning in the book. There's a gene for that. It's part of our gene pool. It's part of what our makeup is as human beings. It's not something that's imposed on us by a religion. It's not something that you can, that you can not have, or you may have degrees of it, or you may be more or less comfortable with. But we all have a spiritual nature, just like we all have an emotional nature, and we all have an ability to, use our five senses and all of those things. This is part of that. Now, to the degree that one, embraces that or doesn't want to embrace that, those are personal choices. But the fact of the matter is that science has shown that we are spiritual beings, that we have this as part of our makeup. And the more we delve into things like quantum physics, and the more we explore things like dark matter, and those kinds of things, which are the mysteries of the universe, the more we will understand that we are something beyond the physical. Let's just put it that way. There's a lot more to talk about on this subject, but our time is running short, so we need to wrap up. But in the meantime, have a wonderful week. Keep looking for those transcendent experiences, those moments of synchronicity. They really are inspiring. I'll see you next week.